As much as I love machines, I love the stories about their genesis, their evolution, and their use just as much or maybe even more. Oftentimes, when I get an idea that I want to pursue or investigate, I end up finding some side element of it interesting enough to be completely obsessed with learning every detail I can find in order to share it here with all of you. Such is the case of the American Liberty Trucks of World War I. You can find some short videos with their specs, which we will surely cover here, but the story of their existence, their creation, and the absolute mess that they were designed to help solve is something seemingly no one has taken the time to tell. That is until today. This is the story of a truck designed for war. Designed by the best minds the United States had for the job during World War I, the Liberty Truck, which through no coincidence carries the same name as the famed V-12 airplane engine of the same time frame, is truly an example of a country that was just starting to feel its industrial might and an army that was completely shambolic when it came to being prepared. Now, I have profiled that legendary V-12 airplane engine on this channel, and you can find the video if you'd like to hear that story as well. To understand how woefully unready the USA was for World War I, we can't start in 1917 when the country jumped into the war with both feet, but we have to instead go back to 1911 when Captain Alexander E. Williams, who over the course of his career would rise to the rank of brigadier general, was advocating for the mechanization of the Army. European armies had started slowly to add trucks and other self-propelled vehicles to replace horses and mules, which had an operating range of about 25 miles a day per Army studies. As history will show us, Williams was not necessarily a guy ahead of his own time, but he certainly was ahead of the time his bosses were running on in the military. The man was largely ignored. Imagine this. In 1911, there were 25,000 trucks registered in the United States. The U.S. Army had 12. Yes, 12. Worse yet, 3 were stationed in San Francisco, 1 was in Houston, 1 was in West Point, New York, and 7 of them had been shipped to the Philippines. Making matters worse, Williams wasn't even the first guy who could clearly see the future but was ignored. Back in 1895, General Nelson Miles, who had been a Civil War soldier, was the commander of the U.S. Army. By the end of his career in the early 1900s, he was asking for the experimentation of motor wagons in the Army but was completely ignored. When he finally did retire in 1903, he wrote to the Secretary of War and in clear terms told the man that the next war the country fought was going to be mechanized and that the preparation should be undertaken to explore the technologies of the day, and like Williams, he was roundly ignored. Of course, Brigadier General Williams was of that same visionary mind, and the lucky thing for him was that he had an ally. Assigned to the Quartermaster Corps for a 4-year stint, Williams had a Quartermaster General named James B. Alshire. Unlike everyone else, and perhaps begrudgingly, allowed Williams to pursue the idea of seeking out the motorization of the Army.
Hey everybody, it's Brian Loans. I'd like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. You know, in this channel I tell the stories of people and things that work together to solve problems and overcome challenges. And that's the work that BetterHelp's 30,000 licensed therapists aim to do each and every day. Whether it's helping you work through feelings of loss, emotional issues, relationship problems, or the stresses of life, BetterHelp is here to help you. I know in my own life, when I felt feelings of loss or loneliness over the course of time, my path to feeling more like myself and better than I had been feeling would have been much easier navigated and short if I'd used the help of a therapist. The best part about BetterHelp is it's all online. It can be done in any environment you're comfortable in, whether that's home or on the road. When you need to reach out, BetterHelp will be there. You can go to betterhelp.com/BrianLoans to get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. When you sign up, you fill out a questionnaire, and you're matched up with a therapist that is best suited to meet your needs. If you don't feel like the match is correct, you can make a switch at any time. BetterHelp works diligently to make sure their therapists are qualified, and their customer service team is always there to answer any questions you may have. Great stories are told in chapters. I know I tell a lot of them. If you go to betterhelp.com/BrianLoans, you'll get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. And when you do that, you can start writing the greatest chapter of your greatest story ever told. Now, back to the show.
Studying the industry and the manufacturers, Williams developed a series of specs as to what he thought the Army needed in a truck. He then got the Army to buy a couple of different trucks for testing purposes. They purchased a 1.25-ton Alden Sampson and a 1.5-ton shaft drive White. Now remember, most trucks at this era were chain-driven. And he then hit the road, meeting with executives and engineers at the major truck building companies to talk about the future, the potential business, and the truck the Army was considering putting out to bid. He was roundly laughed out of every meeting he attended. He was told that his paper truck was unbuildable, impossible, and effectively a waste of time, especially when it came to off-road driving. All the truck companies were able to tout their on-road performance, but off-road, none of them had a lick of confidence in a machine that Williams wanted to build, and if it could even be built, if it would be a success. Williams was shocked at the lack of interest and the lack of foresight, also the seeming lack of business sense he was met with. Returning back to headquarters defeated, Williams saw a small advertisement for a company in Clintonville, Wisconsin. They called themselves Four-Wheel Drive, FWD for short, and they advertised a car that seemingly did all the stuff Williams was told was impossible. Aylshire granted Williams' request to leave on one last-ditch trip, and off to Wisconsin he went. When he arrived, he found a cramped shop with 5 cars in the process of being assembled, and it wasn't all that impressive to look at. As good fortune would have it, while Williams was visiting FWD, they finished one of the 5 cars in process. They sent Williams out with a company test driver named Frank Dorn, and what happened next blew Williams' mind. Dorn drove him through mud pits, sand pits, through plowed fields, and even drove the car up the courthouse steps to demonstrate the unstoppable nature of four-wheel drive. Williams didn't just enjoy the ride. For the price of $1,940, and on behalf of the U.S. Army, he ordered an FWD model for demonstration and testing purposes. Tests? Oh boy, he was in for one. Williams wanted to test motorized vehicles in the types of environments one may expect on a battlefield, and he got his wish in 1912. The 1912 Army Road Test was deceptively named. A 1,509-mile journey from Washington, D.C. to Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana. This trip was made in a V-shape. The convoy would leave Washington, D.C. and then head south through Virginia, the Carolinas, into northern Georgia, and then go north through Tennessee, Kentucky, and finally ending up in Indiana. The, quote, road part was the deception here, as few of them actually existed in any paved form. This would be a slog that was seemingly destined to prove no vehicle was worthy of the Army's true attention. Additionally, the trucks participating were laden with the supplies and an additional 3,000 pounds of sand ballast. Why? Because that's what the brass wanted. Now, there was an open invitation given to all the truck manufacturers in the company. It was only accepted by White and Autocar, who both sent factory stock versions of their 1.5-ton trucks. The Army had their FWD and a couple of their own vehicles as well. 4 trucks left Washington, D.C. on February 8, 1912. Williams projected the trip to take 3 weeks. It took nearly 6. 3 weeks alone were spent getting through North Carolina. Muck, breakage, horrible weather, and the non-existent roads meant that every mile was a battle. One White was so busted up they abandoned the thing and kept going. 3 of the 4 rigs finished the trip, arriving on March 28th. Upon arrival, the engines were torn down and found to be in fine shape. Fuel economy ranged from 4 to 5 miles per gallon. Oil consumption ranged between 110 to 120 miles per gallon of oil swallowed by the engines. Amazingly, once again, the Army brass was simply not impressed. Williams had proven a massive point, though. Not only did he complete the trip, albeit slowly, it was done with a modicum of mechanical failure, and 75% of the starting vehicles actually finished. The Army had the remaining rigs go on another journey straight away to resupply a remote base. This trip was another success and more smooth than the first one. Williams was then moved to another Army post where his focus was no longer on the mechanization movement. Being a small army in peacetime, his accomplishments and achievements had no immediate impact. He had planted a seed, but it wasn't really germinating yet. And then, World War I erupted in 1914, and the U.S. Army did nothing. Car companies and truck manufacturers were pounded with orders from Europe. Companies like Mack and FWD were facing down orders of thousands of vehicles, all for foreign war export. The U.S. Army was ordering next to nothing. What would it take to jolt them into action? As it turns out, a Mexican outlaw named Pancho Villa. When Brigadier General Jack Pershing was dispatched by President Woodrow Wilson to seek and destroy Villa after a deadly attack in 1916, he didn't just go with men, he went with machines as well. With less than 1,000 vehicles dispersed throughout the entire Army, Pershing's request for 5 motorized truck trains of 27 rigs apiece exposed a horrifying reality to the quartermaster's office. Scraping together what they could and ordering what they needed, Pershing ended up with 22 companies of 25 trucks apiece. This, as it turned out, was a fiasco beyond comprehension. In the 11-month campaign, Pershing had 128 different makes and models of vehicles running around the desert of the Southwest and up to 500 miles deep in Mexico. The parts and supplies alone were a disaster. There were not nearly enough mechanics or people who knew how to drive, so civilians actually filled a lot of those jobs. In the end, Pancho Villa was never caught, but the Army finally had to face a cold and hard reality. They were woefully behind the times. On February 15, 1917, the expedition was recalled. There were larger things on the horizon, like fighting a world war. On September 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. It had 2,400 trucks, 2,400 trucks in a country where 400,000 existed and 5 million motor cars were on the roads. Pershing was again tapped to lead the American Expeditionary Force in Europe, and like so many things about the USA in World War I, what started as a trickle was soon to turn into a flood. But the trickle was just that when he arrived in France. A pitiful 33 trucks came with him when he got there. He immediately wrote home and said he needed 50,000. Begging and pleading for resources, the incoming torrent of American troops were moved basically by requisitioning every available French truck, something that was both inefficient and embarrassing. Over the course of the American Expeditionary Force's time in Europe, more than 294 makes and models of vehicles were used, and 213 of them were made in the United States. This equated to the management of more than 60,000 different and non-interchangeable parts, not including nuts and bolts. It was the most glaring example of the lack of American preparedness, but it wasn't just limited to the USA. Multiple reports of the era talk about a 12-story building in Paris housing hundreds of clerks, managing more than 2 million parts for the European effort. To call it a complete shambles would be kind on all sides. In July of 1917, in the midst of all this, finally a light bulb went off. Military officials met and the call to standardize Army trucks, or at least a few of them, went out, and it was answered quickly and awesomely. In August, a young organization called the Society of Automotive Engineers gathered 50 of the leading men from the truck makers of America. In closed session they sat, learning the problems that the Army was having and how it was their duty to solve them, here and now. In a move that mirrored the work done by Packard and Hall Scott on the Liberty V12, but in a much grander scale, these engineers agreed to drop their competitive industry guard and team up to design the best truck America ever had, at least for its desired role. 50 engineers were divided into 8 teams, each with a specific part of the truck to design: suspension, engine, driveline, etc. They designed a light truck and a heavy truck. The light truck was rated for little more than a ton, but the heavy truck was rated to 3 to 5 tons, and like the airplane engine, would be known as the Liberty Truck. Calling it this removed any competitive advantage from an existing manufacturer that could be used against their commercial rivals. Like a kid cramming for a big test, the work went at breakneck speed. In fact, 69 days after their meeting, they were running and driving examples of their truck. This was good because the Army ordered 43,000 of them, and they wanted them yesterday. How and what were these things are the two questions you're asking, right? Well, for starters, they were mechanical mules devoid of any semblance of comfort or extraneous stuff. Let's start with the engines. A flathead 4-cylinder with a bore of 4 3/4 inches and a stroke of 6 inches worked out to 425 cubic inches. That's basically 121 millimeters of bore and 152 millimeters of stroke for a liter displacement of just under 7 liters. With a compression ratio of about 5:1, the engine produced 52 horsepower, which was a robust number for the day and plenty of power along with torque to get the job done. Additionally, the trucks used a drive shaft with a worm drive axle, so the torque multiplication was insane. The downside? With a 4-speed stick, they were flat out at 15 miles per hour. More than 150 companies were contracted to make the 7,500 parts for the truck. For example, the engines. The Buda Engine Company made the timing gears. Waukesha made the cylinders, heads, and governor, along with the exhaust and intake manifolds. Continental also made cylinders and the crankcase, which was aluminum. Hercules made pistons, and Wisconsin made the lower crankcase, oiling system, and additional timing gears. Using uniform and standardized parts from all these companies ensured that no matter who was making what or where it was coming from, it would all fit together. The effort across the board was astonishing. For instance, the Park Drop Forging Company worked 3 shifts for a week straight to create the dies for the crankshafts, and by the end of the first week, they were smashing out cranks. This was a process that normally took about a month. The same was the story for the aluminum crankcase and casting process. Something that was normally a month long took 5 days. The execution of the paired cylinders was also done in less than 10 days from conception to the first castings being machined. The neatest stat on all these things potentially is the fact that companies were handed blueprints on September 9, 1917, and 19 days and 18 hours later, a running engine existed. The dozens of other manufacturers making the individual parts for the trucks like radiators, wheels, springs, and every other thing that worked all did it in the same way. No one company knew what the others were making. They just knew that they had to make their parts to their spec and get them made as quickly as possible. 15 companies were selected to assemble these trucks. They were the Bethlehem Truck Company, Brockway Trucks, Diamond T, Garford, Graham Bernstein, Indiana, Kelly, Packard, Pierce Arrow, Republic, Selden, Service, Valley, and U.S. Motor Truck. There was also an air of intrigue to all this. These trucks, especially the first two, were a protected military secret. As proof of concept, one was built in the Detroit area and one was built at the Selden Truck Plant in New York State. They were built in guarded private buildings, and the parts, small ones were express shipped, and larger ones were sent with guards on fast trains to the plants. By September 30th, 1917, multiple engines from multiple assembly points were in the hands of assemblers. The deadline for rolling an operating chassis was October 10th, and it was delivered on October 7th. The 160-inch wheelbase open-cab trucks weighed about 10,000 pounds empty, and if that seems heavy, consider the fact that the front end had 10 leafs per pack and 17 per pack in the rear, and these were not thin leaf springs. The cast steel wheels up front weighed 300 pounds apiece, and the rear wheels weighed 600 pounds apiece, and these trucks were equipped with 2 of those 600-pounders per side in the rear. The first 2 completed trucks were driven from their respective plants to the White House for a personal inspection by Woodrow Wilson, of course then the president. They were celebrated through every town they passed by. Crowds lined the streets, making 3.5 miles per gallon loaded and 7.5 miles per gallon empty, and carrying a 22-gallon fuel tank. They were stopping with enough frequency for plenty of people to get a look. The trucks were seen as nationally heroic. Newspapers across the country ran breathless stories about how this machine was created from scratch by the leading authorities on trucks, people putting their industrial differences aside for the cause of the war. It was patriotism and industry putting their best foot forward. These were super trucks, or at least they were projected to be in the media. Sure, there was a lot of propaganda, but it was also a national pride issue for a company still trying to gain the respect of other countries with eons more history and prestige. Like a gangling teenager destined to be a great athlete, these machines were the harbinger of things to come. But back to the trucks. The first machines built were called Series 1 trucks, and they had an interesting electrical layout. They used a battery, a generator, and a distributor to fire the spark plugs, but also had a magneto backup. Each cylinder carried 2 plugs. All were crank start, and the driver chose which ignition to use by a switch on the dash. The earliest of the Series 1 trucks actually used wooden wheels before the cast steel production wheel was up to speed. Every truck built used hard rubber tires. Now, as all this was happening, the U.S. Army formed a new wing of itself, the Motor Transport Corps, which was made about the same time the trucks were being designed. General Meriwether Lewis Walker was placed in charge, and it was headquartered in Tours, France. Recruiting mechanics and drivers, or people who wanted to do both, the Motor Transport Corps School taught attendees the art of convoy driving, the rules of the road, oiling, greasing, and cleaning their trucks, map reading, motorcycle repair and operation, some practical shop work, and oxyacetylene welding. Effectively, it would be this group that kept a freshly mechanized army moving, and the MTC slogan was, "Let's go!" With the entire standardization manufacturing process wailing away, trucks began to fly out of factories. As to not clog the railways, the trucks were driven to the eastern ports to be then disassembled, crated, and shipped to France, where they would be unboxed, reassembled, and moved forward. This part of the process was terribly slow. The first trucks did not arrive on French shores until October of 1918. Their arrival was celebrated in newspapers both home and specifically in France. Check out this headline from the October 4th, 1918 Stars and Stripes newspaper. Over the course of this story, they tout the trucks as being just like a race car with all its serviceable elements able to be worked on and repaired quickly, and they certainly tout all the benefits that have already been touted in the American newspapers to get their soldiers excited for the fact that new machines are on the way. The New York Times was also in on the story and had this to say about the arrival of the Liberty trucks in France. Headline, New Army Truck Mechanical Marvel. Standardization vehicle is result of cooperation by many automobile experts. Developed in a few weeks. 60 factories at work on parts, and output soon will be 4,000 trucks a month. Washington, October 11, 1918. Details of the new standardized motor truck said by Army officials to be superior to any now in use in the World War, given out tonight by the Council of National Defense, show that as an example of speedy cooperation, the truck rivals the famed Liberty Aviation engine, which was designed and constructed within a few weeks. 40 engineers and hundreds of draftsmen called in from all parts of the country have been quietly engaged in Washington on the designs, work on which was started a little more than a month ago. Now, of course, some of those timelines were stretched because we know it was 70 days, but it is still an incredible timeline to get a truck out and built to start with. Unfortunately, the construction of the trucks and shipping them to Europe was a boondoggle. Once in France, the trucks were assembled as quickly as possible and pressed into service. The American Expeditionary Force was rapidly swelling to more than 2 million men, and they needed movement as quickly as possible. By now, design changes had the factories building the Series 2 version of the truck, and in that machine, not much was changed. The electric ignition was ditched, only the magneto stayed, and the electric light that was mounted on the dash was replaced by a carbide gas lamp. Mechanically, they were identical to the Series 1 trucks. If you know your World War I history, you know that October 1918 was the bottom of the ninth for this war. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed, ending hostilities and the need for more trucks. The Army canceled their 43,000 truck order, and by the start of 1919, all production had ceased. 9,452 trucks had been produced, about 1,000 had made it to the front, and about 5,000 had made it to France by the time the war ended. The Motor Transportation Corps' major function in France was the operation of maintenance and repair facilities. Reception parks were the locations where the rigs were uncrated and assembled, and they were assigned a registration card so they could be tracked, spare parts were distributed, and markings were added. Then there were the service parks, which were in combat zones out in the open and were the locations where light repair work was completed. Overhaul parks were 30 miles behind the front, had permanent garages, and did heavier repair work. If the fix was more than 30% of the vehicle's original value, it was sent to a reconstruction park. These were massive places, some over 1,000 acres, housing multiple 25,000 square foot shops where, in their confines, salvage and rebuilding operations were the name of the game. 1,000 vehicles could be on hand at any one time, and 3,000 men staffed them. But all of that was over, and it was over pretty quickly. So now what? Send it all home. That's what. The French did not want thousands of trucks on their shores to sell for next to nothing and depress their already hammered truck manufacturing industries, so the Liberty trucks, like the men who drove them, were shipped back to the United States. Amazingly, most of the unshipped trucks were not absorbed by the Army but were sold as surplus to civilians who adapted them to all manner of different jobs in the United States. They were hauling beer and hay, produce and coal, and moving gravel like they were munitions and men in France. Today, only about a dozen of the trucks are in existence, and of that dozen, about 3 to 5 are in actual operating condition. Restorations are few and far between now, and we're over nearly 110 years from their first introduction, so that makes sense. In 1920, the Motor Transport Corps made transcontinental trips, which were like Williams' 1912 journey on steroids, and they were as miserable, but exponentially so. Dwight D. Eisenhower was on one of the 1919 missions, and many credit his experience battling muck, sand, and bad bridges as one of the drivers for the massive expansion of the USA highway systems under his presidency. So, was the Liberty truck the best truck of World War I? Objectively, no. Perhaps it wasn't even second. Two other private companies were sending incredible volumes of trucks to the Western Front. They were Mack and FWD. Understand that those two names did not appear when we talked about the companies actually assembling Liberty trucks. They were too busy. Mack shipped more than 6,500 trucks to the war effort, and they performed with such toughness, reliability, and loyalty, British troops nicknamed them the Bulldog. Of course, it would be years before that became the Mack logo, but the name and legacy of the Mack AC looms large. The AC was seemingly indestructible. It could be driven hard, overloaded, and with its battlefield reputation, it was a massive seller for the company. Staying in production until 1938, they made more than 40,000 of them. Among the strongest and most robust trucks ever built, they were still working in the 1950s and some into the 60s on American construction projects. Many still on solid rubber tires. FWD, that plucky little outfit that Williams visited in 1911, had grown into a colossus of a company by the end of the war. They shipped 2,925 of their four-wheel drive Model B trucks to Britain, and the U.S. ordered 30,000 of them, with 14,473 having been delivered before the armistice was signed. The FWD had actually beaten the Liberty truck to the punch with some standardization. Because they themselves couldn't handle the production, FWD had Kissel, Mitchell, Peerless, and Premier all building their Model B trucks. To prove the efficacy of their system to concerned buyers, they actually had one of the trucks built with parts from all 4 factories and all 4 companies to show how it all worked together, and that demonstration went swimmingly. There were so many FWDs in motion because of their capability and versatility. Their performance really did pack a punch. These 3-ton trucks, beyond the Liberties and the Max, actually helped to win World War I in a larger capacity. If it could be hauled, the FWD hauled it, and through the worst muck, mire, and horribleness of the battlefield. Had the Liberty trucks been introduced sooner and produced at the projected volume, along with potentially having 4-wheel drive, their role would have been far, far more massive, and they would have had a huge impact. But the war was basically over when they showed up. The FWDs were there through it all, good, bad, or otherwise. So what are we left to think of the Liberty trucks? In the end, they changed American trucking for the better. They had little effect on World War I, but they had a huge effect on American industry. Because they were so celebrated domestically, all the companies involved got to brag on their roles post-war, which helped their sales. The combined technology and ideas advanced the development of heavy trucks in the USA light years from where they had been before the war. The Liberty truck was really a remarkable effort that simply came too late. Had the Army actually listened to those who knew better early on, the Liberty trucks could have actually shortened the war in my estimation. Logistics are where the whole shooting match is won or lost. If the 43,000 trucks were delivered and that number swelled to 60 or 70,000, those type of volume numbers that help move huge armies, their arms and supplies, would certainly give a massive advantage to the side that had them all. The Liberty trucks shouldn't be forgotten, nor should they be over-credited with their role in the First World War. I do love the story, though. Anytime differences can be set aside for the greater good and the end result is a relatively indestructible truck, that's a win. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more rumbling, roaring, clanking, and banging 52 horsepower mechanical, automotive, racing, and gearhead history.